Kank.
Bert, Bert.
I love the power of digital rendering.
Uh-oh. We're getting a feedback. Wait a minute. It's
You have,
delayed. It's weird. It was on my.
oh, did you have something going on?
No, I had it on my iPhone, and we
Oh.
just went over on the iPhone. So it's like
Well,
I've even done that thing where you have the TV on upstairs and downstairs in the house, and like I'm going to go downstairs and watch something, and you can hear the upstairs TV half a second delay compared to the down. It's the same cable company coming on the same wire, but yet when it goes through the boxes, it's somehow delayed a little bit.
that's Comcast Inception. That's what that is.
Right. It's a dream within a dream of Comcast.
That's right. If the top stops spinning, you know what's going on. Hey guys, everybody, welcome all and sundry back to your favorite pandemic podcast, Pencil to Pencil. That's a lot of P's. Your weekly podcast where your best buds in cartooning, Jamar Nicholas. Nice to see you again. And my you know what? We got you this time, Mike. My best bud in full bird kernel of comic books, Mike Manley, is in the building. Mike, tell him what's up.
Colonel, wow.
That's right. Full bird. They see you. That's right. Represent. Holla at the colonel when you see him in the streets.
Hey, everybody.
What up, D. Brad? If this is your first time watching us, you know well, you wouldn't know because you haven't watched it before. We have an international greeting. Well, hello. What happens here?
That's it. That's just the whole podcast.
That's it. It is over. What happens here, dear viewer, is that myself and Mike Manley and sometimes our best bud Brett Blevins, a lot of B's there, come together to talk about what happens on the other side of the creative table or the exhibition table, or
tell me, I'm very curious.
Or the drafting table. Well, you know, Mike, as long as we've been in the business, there's still people who haven't been, right? And I think there's a very interesting chasm in between those two. People have questions. They want to know, what's it like to have people lined up around your table waiting for your signature? That sounds very superstar-like, right? And then also when we talk to our creative buddies in the field, a lot of us kind of, we kind of have the same trajectory in a way, but we all start in different ways. A lot of people tell you that there's not one way in the comics. It's almost like a door that vanishes once you figure your way in. No one else could come in the same way you did, and, we talk shop is really what this is about.
It's car talk for comics.
That's right. Yo, what's up, Tony? Good to see you. Colonel Mike got promoted from mod and master. That's right. Hello. Look at that, Mike. You got a promotion.
I'm in a whole new tax bracket now.
So we had the week off last week because our cup was just a little too full to go in and podcast. But we're back. We're back with a grand spectacle of a show tonight. Only the best Diamond A+ Jim Mint guests we have on Pencil to Pencil, Mike Manley.
Jim Mint.
That's right.
All of our guests, unfortunately, though, at the end of each episode, are forced to be slabbed for preservation.
Right. We're gonna have to
tell Jim that.
We're gonna have to get Jim slabbed, but then also there has to be somebody to authenticate it.
Right. The authenticator is on his way.
Right, he just, he peeps it just to make sure it's legit, and then we put a stamp on it. But I think we're just going to get right to it. So, again, let me kind of give you the rules of engagement. So, this is a live stream where we're going to talk shop, where you, dear viewer, can be a part of the show. If you have a question for our guest, myself or Mike Manley, feel free to put it into the chat or into the replies, or if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, it's a little different. And if it brings any value or worth to our conversation, I'll bring it in. You're not guaranteed a reply, but shoot your shot. Okay, Mike, I love me some straight up cartooning, right? I love like raw bone cartoonists. I've
What
been
is
a
a raw bone? No, what is a raw?
well, don't dig into it too deep. It's just kind of like when you see some people's stuff and you're just like, yo, it hits that that nerve. Jim Rugg is like that with me. Jim Rugg is a fantastic cartoonist. He, as a lot of us, almost all of us, Mike, I don't think you could be a cartoonist and not have a compulsion to draw. Right? You can't like sometime it and be a professional cartoonist. You have to breathe that, right? And
You can always tell the people in the class that are cartoonists or potential future cartoonists because they're the people that are never paying attention. They're like drawing. They're drawing in their books. They're drawing. The teacher's talking, ma, 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 and you're like drawing.
Right. And sometimes we used to get sent to the special class for for doing that.
They beat you up and break your pencil.
I have to just stack blocks for a period every day at school.
Or I would always I would have the book open and then I would have the comic.
Oh yeah.
The teacher would see that and then take it joink to the end of class.
But the world has changed now, right? We're in a whole different place with that, and just how people even react to the art form. So we'll have a really fantastic talk tonight. But before I bring Jim Rugg in, I gotta pay that water bill. So we're repping Philly. I know Jim's a Pittsburghian. We might have to fight before the show is over. But
we'll have to fight in the middle, Pennsylvania.
Oh, I'm sorry, Foyt. It's Foyt.
Foyt.
You see the John above my head. That's a very Philadelphian word. Our good buddies at Graphicsly make Clip Studio Paint. Yes, that Clip Studio Paint is one of our sponsors. And also our good buddy over at Tomorrow's Publishing, John Morrow, is the fine publisher of Mike Manley's award-nominated magazine, Draw! Exclamation point. That's right. Please go support.
Go to tomorrows.com. John always has some kind of a special or some kind of bundle or some kind of a discount at Tomorrow's. He'll hook you up.
Yeah. Tell him Jamar, the crusty critic.
Tell him Johnny Carson.
Tell Johnny Carson sent you. That's wild.
What the hell is a Johnny Carson?
All right, let's get this started. Let's bring in Jim Rugg and see what he's got to say. Woo-hoo, welcome to the show, my man. Ka-kank. You love the graphics, bro.
What's up, guys? Happy to be here. Good to see both of you.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, it's good to see you. I'm glad you were able to come on, Jim. You're one of the people I've reached out to where almost all of us at this point in our career may not be so easy to catch these days, right? You're a busy guy.
Everybody's busy. It's a weird thing. I remember whenever I was a kid and my parents, all the parents were busy because they had kids. I don't have any kids and I still feel like I'm the busiest person on earth. And I can't really explain it. I don't know what's going on. I guess with all our devices, it's just more efficient. But everybody's busy.
Better to be busy than to be like, oh, what am I going to do today?
It's very true.
Nobody loves me.
Well, do you see kind of like does it get harder to balance engagements and appearances and requests the busier you get, Jim, or do you kind of find a way to make it all work?
It comes in waves. Like when I get busy in terms of doing podcasts and things, it's usually when I have something new. And, I'm talking about it on all my social media. And that's when I usually hear from people like, hey, do you want to come on, our podcast or on our show? Mm-hmm. And so that works out all right. At least that's how it's been the last couple of years now that, there are a lot of these kind of media outlets, social media outlets, whatever you would call these. But it does seem like it's coincided with, I have a new project I want to try to sell. Let's do some of these. So yeah, it works out all right. I can't really complain. I know I say I'm busy and I am, but it's nothing I can't manage. It's a pretty good balance at the moment.
Right.
Imagine back in the day, like in the 60s or the 70s, if there was like a podcast, Stan and Jack and Ditko or something. Ditko would never probably go on anybody's podcast, or he would just have a there would be just like a drawing with a question mark on it, you know, and you would hear his voice. Although I did talk to him on the phone once.
Wow, what was
So
that like?
you called the office. What happened?
I did an issue of Daredevil with Al Williamson. So John Romita Jr. Had to have like an issue off. And so Carl Potts, who was a big fan of Ditko, who was the editor, Carl, got Ditko to do a fill-in issue. And then he sent it to Al because he was the regular inker. But at that point, Ditko was just sort of doing breakdowns. And so when Al got it, he was like, this is like, you know, I mean, it was literally like the doll kind of thing, you know? And Al wasn't really a finisher, so he was going to send it back. But I said, no, keep it. I'll tighten it up. And so I did that, and then he and I inked it. So I tightened it up, make it look like wood inking Ditko, right? Which is a great thing for guys of our generation, right? And then Al was going to give me his part. And then I figured, well, if I could get Ditko to give me if he wanted to sell his pages. So I called him and I had no idea. I just knew that, like, you're not supposed to say Doctor Strange or Spider-Man. Then it would be like, slowly I turn or something, you know, like, Costello bit.
Oh, wow.
And so I talked to him, and he just sounded like a, you know, normal guy, but he's like, oh no, I never sell my artwork. Or I thought he was going to be, you know, some supercharged thing, but he was just like, sort of like, I don't know, talking to your uncle or something.
Yeah, I've known of people who have had some interaction with him, very, very casual, very limited, but it's always been similar to what you describe. It's not, you know, I don't know what we make or made Ditko out to be in our minds, but just a regular guy, if you actually did come in contact with him, at least from the few people I know who have had contact with him.
So before we went on and we were in the green room, we were kind of talking about those connections, and that's usually what happens with old art buds. Like, man, I can't even remember when we met. How did we meet? Oh, was it in a car accident? You know, it must have been. And it's scary that you're starting to stack decades on top of things, which, you know, that's kind of hard to swallow sometimes. And I think we came to the conclusion that we all met at the same show, which might have been a small press expo in like the early thousands. Does that sound right? I think I met you before that. I think I met you before. You met Jim before me. Maybe that was it.
No, Mike, we might have met at a Pittsburgh convention, possibly.
Yeah, I did one or two, and then I didn't do any for a long time. Because the late Chris Jamar was always holding court there. That guy was amazing. He could sell. You know, he could, what was it, iced Eskimos or whatever, you know, one of those old old things. I mean, he was such a gregarious kind of, so you probably knew him since you're from the Pittsburgh area, right?
You know, we didn't overlap much because I went to, like, the first show I did was the Pittsburgh Comic Con, I'm going to say 2000. And like, I was self-publishing black and white auto bio, horrible comics. And it was my first show, so I didn't know what to expect. And I ended up, in like, there was an aisle that was all Playboy models, B movie, like Scream Queens. There may have been a stripper, you know, but it was like this was the girls aisle, and by girls I mean, like, you know, the everybody's like filthy old dad would be walking this aisle,
the aisle of flesh,
and that's where my table was. So, you know, like, I was kind of out of it a little bit in terms of comics, and it wasn't a great show for me. You know, it was kind of, that was a tough time for comics anyway, 2000, and mainstream comics and Pittsburgh comic convention. It just wasn't a great show. The second show I did was SPX, also in 2000, you know, a few months later. And that show made so much more sense to what I was doing, which were like mini comics and photocopied kind of stuff, more experimental comics. And it felt like, oh, this is my tribe. And I really got away from that kind of what I identified as mainstream comic conventions, because things were popping up that were like alternative and small press shows. Besides SPX, there was Space in Columbus, small press, an alternative comics expo. That was an easy drive for me.
There you go.
Mocha was starting then, New York. So it was sort of like SPX in New York. Again, very drivable for me. So I was doing these small press shows. TCAF started around that time.
Oh, wow.
And I really got away from like, oh, I'm going to go to the superhero show. And I didn't do that for a long time. And now it's kind of like most of the comic shows that I do now, it feels like it's just everybody's there. Shows like Heroes, just a celebration of comics art. It's almost like whatever comics you're into, you can find people that are also into them at a show like Heroes. So, it's kind of evolved like everything does. But I didn't spend a lot of time in that like Pittsburgh Comic-Con group. I never felt comfortable there.
It's funny, we were talking about this before the show, that I felt that there was definitely, maybe also due to sort of like Fantagraphics was pretty heavy at the time, kitchen sink. So there was like, there's underground comics and whatever mainstream guys they decided were cool, right? And then anybody else was not cool. And then there was that separation of what independent, and then there was the underground, like we were saying, like the original underground, like Crumb and Spain Rodriguez and those guys. And then there was that weird, because like Corbin was in there, and he's like a guy who was kind of like, well, he was working for Warren. He was doing his stuff in Europe. He was like one of the first Americans to really break Europe. But there was definitely these different stratas, or you were in this group. If you worked for Marvel, it's like, no, you're not you're a different kind of cartoonist. And I always liked all kinds of cartooning. I liked, and as I was saying in the green room, Mad Magazine was sort of the portal between Mad and like National Lampoon. I thought were like the portal between mainstream and like you could go all the way up to New Yorker, right? And advertising, or all the way through Mad to Crumb and Mobius and the guys from Europe that were all influenced by that too as well.
Yeah, it's interesting if you really start digging into the comics history part, because, as you say, like going into Crumb and Mobius, it makes me think of heavy metal. You had mentioned the Warren magazines with Richard Corbin. The magazines are sort of a third group or something. Because, if you lump Mad in with the magazine crowd, it really does become like a pretty large survey of different styles and different cartoonists. And whenever I think of comics from that era, I don't think that broadly. I always think like there's Marvel and DC, and then there's like alternative. But yeah, there are those other groups, and maybe it's because magazines don't fit in a comic book box, so they end up in their own section.
There is that. I mean, I watched your show on heavy metal, and I was just like shaking my head, yes. I was 15. So technically, me buying it was actually against the law because it had to be 18 because there was like nudity and whatever. But those magazines were probably better distributed than comic books because they were like in 7-Elevens and drugstores and any little mom and pop shop you could get Easy Rider and Mad Magazine and Heavy Metal. You could get some laughs and titties, and your Mountain Dew or your Coors Light or whatever, have a good weekend.
That's a one-stop shopping right there. I love it.
Yes.
Slim Jim and some heavy metal. What else do you need?
Well, I was going to ask Jim a question about kind of like how, we talked a little bit about the tribalism of just kind of cartoonists grouping together. It could be regional. It could be from the locale of the shows that you're going to. Did you feel like when you were doing the Pittsburgh show a little bit like, well, these guys aren't really speaking my language? And then alternatively at the SPX shows, did you feel like more welcomed beyond just the artwork? Like, did you feel the energy was different at a show like SPX?
Yeah, the energy was definitely different. Excuse me. Sorry. The Pittsburgh Comic-Con was, like I said, 2000, it's a tough time for comics, especially, like Comic Shop, Diamond, Marvel DC Comics Image. That was a tough time. And so like the energy at the Pittsburgh Comic-Con, I remember it as being pretty low. Like people come there was so much stuff there too. Like I said, I was in an aisle with Playboy models from the past 3 decades. So like you could come to that show with no interest in comics and sort of entertain yourself. There'd be some actors there. Wrestlers were big at the time. So I think Guar was there maybe.
Oh yeah.
So, like there, it wasn't just comics. It was a lot of stuff. It was moving in that pop culture direction that, certainly some conventions have gone in. And that's kind of what it was like. And for me, like all I cared about were the comics. So I didn't love that energy. I didn't feel like, oh, these are, I found my people here. SPX was just comics. And so like, it was totally like, I can remember coming back from there and I had a friend who made comics too. We drove together, and rode home. And it was almost like we had met all these different cartoonists, and it was like we knew them better than we knew people we had grown up with our whole life. We had so much in common. So I did feel that energy, like and I struck up friendships there where it was like trading comics with people through the mail for years, that I met at that first show. And so like that connection, it was night and day compared SPX and Pittsburgh Comic-Con at that time for me. And some of it was my own taste. That was a time when I was still like, I had gone over to the alternative comics camp. If you had to pick sides, I was done with Marvel and DC and I was in the alternative camp. And, that's what SPX was. So, the comics made more sense to me. The cartoonists made more sense. Even the people that were there who were just interested in, if you were attending SPX, you were there for comics because there wasn't anything else.
Right.
And, all of that that was what I wanted. It was amazing. It was like, I'd found my people. I had found my place. It was really, I don't know. There was a sense of like, this is right. I'm on the right path. This is, keep talking to everybody, pick up as many of those comics as you can, follow up. And I did, I kind of developed friends and peers out of that very first SPX. So definitely there was a difference between those two shows and how I felt I fit in.
One other thing I wanted to just add to that, because Jim, you and I kind of have a similar start in the business. My first comic book conventions were SPX. Like that was my first, my ground zero was SPX. And one thing that I think I got disillusioned with was just kind of like how, I don't want to say how nice everybody was, but there was just, kind of like a campsite energy to how everybody interacted with each other. People were trading sketchbooks around, people doing sketches for each other. Nobody was trading money. It was right. It was just like, it was all for the love. And then I started doing mainstream shows. I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. This isn't how I, what I signed up for. But the one thing I wanted to add to is also I started paying attention to craft and being just amazed by what other people were doing. Like, did you kind of bite into that too? Kind of like, how did you make this? What is this? How did you staple this? Like, were you having those conversations too?
100%. Like I was doing silk screening in my garage downstairs after those shows because you would see guys. Like I remember picking up a comic from Dan Zetwalk out of St. Louis, and it was about submarines in the Civil War, and it had a screen printed cover with like French flaps. This was essentially a mini, like it was handmade by Dan Zetwalk, but it had all these bells and whistles. I went home with that comic and it's like, that might've been the best comic I read that year. It did not, I did not need the production value of offset printing or anything to make a great comic is what I learned from that. Right. But it was inspiring because like there were a couple of colors of ink on the cover, that he had printed himself. And it just felt like, you could make 50 comics and they could literally be as good as any comic that you find at the comic book store. And with tools that you kind of have access to, like I taught myself to screen print based on Jordan Crane's. He had like a print PDF online, which I printed out at work and made into a zine for myself that I still have somewhere. But it had information just on like how to scan different printing things from, like what kind of resolution, if you're going to use a laser printer. How to silk screen, Brian Ralph had a silk screening thing in there and Jordan Crane might've had one, but it was all these like practical bits of knowledge. If you wanted to make your own stuff, like from photocopies to screen printing to, prepping files for offset print, it was all there. And it just felt like, I can make whatever comics I want. This is my guide and I know other people that do it. I can reach out to them if I need some answers. And it was great. It was like permission to just do your own thing. You didn't need there, like it was no more gatekeepers.
Right.
That was it. I had seen at SPX proof that you could do this. And I've had a couple of those experiences. I was at a show in Minneapolis and I ended up at Uncivilized Books. And I don't know if you know Uncivilized Books. They started out making mini comics. It was Tom Kaczynski. It is Tom Kaczynski. But he would make these mini comics and I would get them either at shows or might order them from his website. And they were beautiful. They were really nicely made, pressed tight, trimmed perfectly. And I'm like, man, these are so nice. And when I saw his studio space where he was making these, it looked like my office cubicle. There was like the long arm paper cutter, nothing fancy, no hydraulic cutter or anything.
Right.
A black and white laser printer that he would print the guts with. And like, I'm looking around and I left there going, oh, there's no excuse not to make great looking I have access to the same equipment. This is middle of the road office equipment. This isn't some print shop. And yet he was able to make these gorgeous, amazing, perfect looking books. And so I left there thinking same thing. Like, I just don't have excuses. If I want to make a good looking book, I have all the same equipment, make a good looking book, or admit that you can't, but it wasn't an equipment issue. The barrier for entry was, I kept seeing examples that it was very low, like you could do this. You have access to a laser printer and, paper cutter's $20 or something. Like, you could do this if you wanted to. And that was a huge thing for me.
Well, all right. Well, let me get one more thing in, Mike, and then we'll switch gears. Another thing about that time, I'm thinking, Jim, I'm not exactly sure when you broke in. So I'm thinking, for me, it was like around the late 90s, like 97, 98, around there. Just the knowledge of how to make a comic book, even like a mini or a zine or an ash can or whatever was popping at that time, was so limited. And just walking into your local Kinko's didn't always give you purchase. I remember just having total failures at 3 a.m. because the guy had no idea what I was talking about. Do you have any stories about trying to figure it out?
Yeah, I have that same experience. Like the information was so valuable in the beginning. I would read any article, like in a newspaper, if it was somehow related, like this guy's connected to comics somehow. I would read everything because it was impossible to find stuff. And it's the reason that I would read Wizard, because they would have like some original art pages. Sometimes they'd have an article about making a mini comic or self-publishing or something. Like it was hard to find that info. I'm trying to think of my bad stories are, I didn't know anybody or how to make comics exactly. And I had heard you could offset print comics out of this place in Florida. It was like something co-ops, small press co-op or something.
Oh, I remember this. Yo, you just blew my head up. I remember that spot.
So, but it was like 1,000 of them. You had to get 1,000 of them. And the kicker is like 1,000 was like, I don't know, $1,100. 2,000 was like $1,250. So of course you had to get 2,000.
Right.
I needed like 4. And I had no idea, I sent the check and sent them artwork or photocopies, whatever you had to send, but you had to send some kind of physical thing that they were going to shoot from. And, they like 6 boxes of poorly packed comics showed up at my house. And like I said, I had no way of selling them. No, they were terrible. They were the worst comics I ever made, but I didn't know any better, So my snafu was, instead of making 20 photocopies at Kinko's and being stuck with 16, I made 2,000 and, spent the next 20 years, like tucking them into garbage at the curb.
Happy birthday, my comic again.
Yes. So, that was my horrible mistake, but I had all kinds of stuff, like printing one page wrong. That's always a bummer. I would have people at copy shops be like, hey, this is copyright material. And I'd have to produce ID and be like, I'm the guy, like, look, it's copyright. It's my name. So, little stuff like that. But I think everybody that ever made, the fun part of making mini comics are those stories, though. It is putting the stuff together like the night before the show and having, whoever you could rope into, like, okay, you're stapling and you're folding. It was that was kind of part of the fun of that. Those early days.
I learned about printing and everything in high school because I had 2 commercial art classes, which I've talked about before on the podcast. One was actually printing, just learning how to, do all the stuff pre-press and then press. And then I had another class that showed you how to make all the mechanicals and lettering and just all the basic stuff so I started doing that when I was 15. So I could print. I knew how to do all the pre-press stuff, which really does help when you're talking to a printer to speak to a printer in the language of a printer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and before the internet, I knew that stuff. Now, when the internet came out, I remember people would do the little mini comic thing, and they would have the little thing like how you can take this piece of paper and make your signatures, right? And you can cut it here and whatever. But before the internet, and even with the internet, you had to know what to ask. What specifically do you want to know about the printing process, right? Because you're right, when you go to Kinko's, you're going to get, hey, hello, sir. What would you like me to do today? Some teenager, right, who doesn't know anything. He just knows, like, I remember once even trying to get somebody to put the thing the right way in the copy. Right? So there's a lot of that technical hurdle of how to make your product that's completely separate from drawing your product.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And even, like resolutions and stuff would be confusing to me early on, because like I'd see it on screen and it'd be like, it looks right. And then I'd print it out and it would be pixelated and it would be impossible for me to figure it out. Like go back and check it on screen and it looks right there. And, like what happened?
Right.
It was so, it was very frustrating. But, I think to some extent you do have to take the bumps somewhere along the way, to kind of figure those things out and to, make a couple of expensive mistakes and learn never to do that again. Or press harder on those questions that you're not sure about. It's almost learning what you don't know. I think that all the time with Cartoonist Kayfabe, where it's like, I'm constantly learning about huge gaps in my knowledge. The more we do it and the more I read or see, it's almost like just opening doors of like, wow, I've never even looked at Italian comics, or
Right.
this cartoonist that's now my favorite. I didn't even know they existed last Thursday. It's
Right.
it's kind of great. It's one of my favorite parts about comics at the moment is how vast they are, and it feels like there's a lot of frontier. Well, it's not even it's frontier for me because it's new, but that other people have like explored and done interesting work that I haven't even discovered that map yet.
Right. Well, because you have the whole Franco-Belgian thing. Then you've got all the manga artists who've been going for 70 years now, right? Or more. And they had their whole studio system with all their assistants and how, like Tezuka and how he influenced people. And one of the things I always tell the students is that if you're looking at anime, you're also looking at Disney and Fleischer and the early Marvel, the early DC stuff, put through their cultural lens, because they were seeing that stuff after the war, before the war, and then after the war when the soldiers were there for occupation. All the American comics started going in, and you can see that reflected in their, like, people here take manga now and they're like, they're all influenced and they think it's fresh, but they're actually taking things that were stuff that we started here, just went through their machine, and now we're taking it and putting it back through our machine. It's like these same ideas of cartooning and exaggeration and the visual language keep going through each culture. Like you can look at something and go, that's a Belgian cartoonist. That's a Japanese cartoonist. That's a French cartoonist influenced by a Japanese cartoonist.
Yeah, there's I just saw a book, and it's about like the early days of manga and some of the Western influences that entered early on, like George McManus is bringing up Father, and you see that, and then you see certain like early manga, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, this I totally see that. But like after World War II, I think there wasn't television in Japan for a long time. Like big parts of Japan didn't have access to television as they were rebuilding, and like for years. And that's whenever you had like your rental manga shops, and you had people that would like tell stories. I met a Japanese artist who does like picture books and does a little bit of manga, but he would make those I forget what they're called now, but it was like a little stage, it was like a little stage. And when he was a boy, he said people would come around and they would have that like on the back of their bikes, and they would tell these stories. They'd be illuminated from behind, and you would like scroll as like characters and shadows and stuff would move across this. And he
Yeah.
made one. I saw him give a talk with one that he had made, like carrying on that tradition. But you have those as like these ingredients, right, in the beginning of sort of manga's like post-war explosion. I find it all fascinating. I'm really fascinated by their publishing model. Like, I think the Japanese publishers are just, they're so professional in terms of being publishers. Like, their job is to sell manga, and they do it very, very well. And, you know, like, anytime I come in contact with that publishing model, I'm just so impressed with I mean, it's just professional. I don't know another word for it, you know, and I think of like the American version of comics publishing. And I often say, you know, it's, if you define what an industry is, I'm not sure we'd qualify. And there's virtue in that, you know, like it allows people to self-publish and make a mark, you know, and it allows a lot of this stuff to happen. I think there's some real pluses in that model, but it's not professional in my experience. And you see it in sales, you know, I mean, the sales, what do we sell? 1% maybe of what manga sells? Like it's that part's, you know, I mean, that's terrible if you're in this industry,
Right.
you know, it's awful. It's why we all complain about paying the bills, because we're selling, you know, 7,000 copies of Iron Man or something. We should all be ashamed.
But it's a very different culture, because everyone commutes. A lot of people commute. When they commute, they read. So you have a lot more people who read just because of the byproduct of them commuting. And their reading their comics is kind of, I think, more like what reading newspapers was like in the old days, newspaper comics, because there was like stuff for kids, stuff for housewives, stuff for men. There was, if you looked at a comic book page in like 1950, there was every kind of comic. There was a detective comic. There was a comic for little kids. Then Peanuts came in and kind of blew the lid off and expanded it even more. That was when the syndicates, because of the newspapers and because millions of people were buying, you know, like it was like 4 or 5 editions of some newspapers every day. Right. So just, you know, I saw something the other day, or heard something the other day. It was a Phantom podcast. He was read by like 100 million people a day at one point in his thing, globally, like Blondie. They were like in 2,000 papers. So the exposure to that one comic was massive and global. You can't really compare. I mean, even the anime probably penetrates the most. If you're reading like One Piece or something, you know, I mean, it's been around like 30 years now or 20 years, but no newspaper comic penetrates the way that it did. And books, like you said, comic books, you don't sell as many Superman or Spider-Man or Batman away. Yeah.
So, Jim, let's take. I didn't want to cut you off. What were you going to say, Jim?
Oh no, I didn't have anything else to say there.
Let's take this minute to slide into your origin story. One of my favorite things. So, you're originally from Pittsburgh? Yes. Tell us a little bit about how it was growing up and trying to, I don't know, push forward being a cartoonist. When you're saying there weren't a lot of people around you that were doing what you were trying to do.
Yeah.
I
should say, like, I actually grew up an hour south of Pittsburgh, which is a fairly rural area. Like, there were a lot of farms and things. So where I grew up, like, I didn't grow up in a neighborhood. I kind of grew up near the woods, what we called the mountains, you know, just away from everybody. And there was virtually no culture there. You know, it was a pretty depressed area by that point. You know, like, their heyday had been the early 1900s, and by the 90s, it was a long slide from that. And I just wasn't a happy kid, you know, like it didn't look very exciting. The adults that I knew in my life, nobody's making art, nobody's doing the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. You know, it was a very like survive kind of place. And so I got a paper route when I was 10, and that meant a little bit of disposable income. And I bought a comic book and just fell in love with it, because I was drawing, you know, I was drawing in my notebooks at school, and I was drawing like movie characters and wrestlers and really stuff that looked like comics. I just hadn't bought comics. My parents thought comics were for little kids or a waste of money. And once I bought one, by the time I got home, I was like I saw the list of artists in the front and it was like, this is what I want to do. And I never really wavered. So that's probably 10, 11, somewhere in that range. And that was it. You know, like from that point on, everything was sort of aimed at like, I'm going to make comics. And it's interesting because a few years after that, you know, like my goal was to draw Wolverine and X-Men or Batman or whatever. Then all my favorite artists form Image. And it's like, oh, I got to think of my own characters now. I want to do my own book. And, you know, and then I drift away from those and get into alternative comics. But it was the same thing of like, I just want to make my own, you know, I want to draw my own comics. Video stores were big when I was a kid. So that would be the other cultural escape. But the idea of making movies, I mean, you know, if you're growing up in the middle of nowhere pre-internet, like talk about impossible. So the comics thing made sense because I was already drawing and the drawings kind of looked like comics, you know, and that's the direction I went pretty much from that time forward.
Go ahead, Mike.
What was your first indie comic that was not like a Marvel or not what you would buy in the 7-Eleven or the grocery store?
Man, that's a good question, Mike. I'll be honest, I'm not sure. I would get comics at a flea market. And so I would get some random stuff. Like I got hold of a Comic Scene magazine or two, and those were always great, you know, because they would have stuff I'd never heard of. I remember like it must have been a Tundra story or Kitchen Sink or something, but it exposed me to things like Cages. And I ended up finding an issue of Cages at the flea market for $0.25 that just like, you know, like I would see that stuff and it would just be like, I have no idea how to make sense of this, you know, but then I would also like, I bought a big run of Grimjack at a flea market where it was like $9 for like 50 of them. And, you know, that was an indie comic and I fell in love with Tim Truman, but it was really, very random. I didn't have a comic book shop for the first several years as a reader. So it was kind of like whatever I'd come across. And I would find weird stuff at a flea market or, you know, maybe a garage sale or something. But I don't know, like I got a couple of Dark Horse comics pretty early on, maybe even like the Predator miniseries, because I liked that movie. That was my first R-rated movie in a movie theater. And I loved Predator. So when I saw the comic, it was like, man, that looks really badass. And it was, you know, so I kind of would see little bits and pieces, but it was very random, like what I would actually have access to. You know, I had no previews or anything. It was just like what's showing up, you know, at the drugstore or at the newspaper store in my town. And that was mostly Marvel DC. And then it would just be like whatever random stuff I could find. I got a Cyborg comic from Canon Films that was some sort of promotion at my video store. And I walked in one day and it's laying there on the counter and it's like, how much is this comic? And they're like, I don't know, $0.25. Because they, you know, it was a 40-year-old woman that ran the video store. She had no idea what the comic books even still existed, let alone what to charge for them. But that kind of stuff was exciting to me. It was different. And it was just like, I was a sponge, you know, like any comic thing I could find, that's what I would just obsess over.
I think that's a funny thing because I think the further back you go, the more that is actually common, because you would get comics that would be given to you by somebody else. Like my son went off to college, flop, here's a bunch of comics, right?
Yes.
Or a cousin, or, you know, you would find random comics or like comics with the covers torn off, or so you wouldn't even know what the cover looked like back in the day. And, you know, you would get like a Sad Sack comic and like a Richie Rich comic, or you go to the doctor's office and they only had the good comics, you know, they would like, you know, and so, yeah, and at that stage, you kind of like, that's before you're in the beginning, you're just consuming. You're not saying, well, wait a minute, now I'm going to start putting this one here and this one better. And you know what I mean? You're just kind of excited about it.
I got lucky. Probably within the first month of me deciding I'm going to make comics, I found how to draw comics the Marvel way. And I had just bought like Wolverine was a character, you know, because I didn't, like you said, Mike, I didn't know what to buy. So I'd go to like the drugstore and there'd be a spinner rack and I would just look at like, I don't know, what looks cool, what grabs my attention. Wolverine was a character that, you know, that I got on right away. John Buscema was drawing that at the time. So then it's like, I've got a book on how to draw comics by this guy, and I've got a comic with this super cool character by this guy. And so like, I did recognize like comic book artists, you know, I started following comic book artists very early on as a result. And then, you know, the the book, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way, sort of lays out like, you want the action pose, it's back here. It's, it's the front of the action. It's not in the middle. And it made me start to look at comics that way, right? Where it's like, okay, some of these guys are better than others. I probably wasn't qualified to say which were the better ones, but there was a sense that they were different, like pretty early on, I was recognizing that. And I'd be like, I like this, or I started to see like the same artist was on a book, and pretty soon that would be my favorite book then. So I was following guys early, maybe not the right guys, but it was something that I did recognize, like all these comic book artists are not created the same.
Jim, I had a question about just you being from a small town and having access to stuff is really that kind of guides your taste, especially for like a huge part of your young life. So you were saying that really the only places in town were like the drugstore, right? Or maybe at kind of like the swap meet or something like that. Did you have any time with the newspaper strips? You seem like you were a straight comic book guy.
I was, by that point, like I'm delivering newspapers, so, I have access to them, but it's late 80s, early 90s. And at that point, the comic strips in the newspaper were like this big for like 4 panels.
Yeah.
And, Watterson's doing Calvin and Hobbes at that time. Gary Larson, I enjoyed Far Side. Peanuts is still running then, but there weren't a ton of comics. If I were to go through like my page, my daily paper of comics, it would be less than half that I would look at and be kind of interested in, or maybe even read. And that wasn't the path in terms of like, those didn't look as much like what I was drawing. I wanted to draw these big, strong figures punching each other and jumping around. And it was very different than the comic strips I was seeing. And now, I love that stuff. Yeah, Dilbert, I think, was probably on those pages.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah.
But it didn't speak to me the same way as the comic books. There was just something about that comic book format and the art, that I was seeing in the comic books that was more in line with the direction I wanted to go.
So when you were a kid, if your parents bought the paper, did you look at the Sunday funnies?
I would. Yeah, I would, but mostly out of boredom, like it was maybe a couple of them would be in color, on a Sunday. So that was good. I'm trying to think of what all was in there, but like I said, nothing really spoke to me at that point. Garfield would be like the one comics I could find at the local library. And, again, not what I was doing.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny because on this show, we really seem to have people that are like, a lot of people come in from comics, strips, and there's people that come in from comic books. Rarely there's people that are sort of do both, but it usually seems like in the beginning, you're really sort of like attracted by one. Like if you like superheroes and you like action, then you're going right for that stuff. You know what I mean? And if you're not into superheroes, or you kind of like them, but then you seem like you come in from the strip side.
Yeah, and I bet I would guess if we're profiling your guests who are coming from these two angles, they're of a certain age. Because now if you get somebody who's, like I teach some, so like if I have a 23-year-old student, it's anybody's guess where they're coming from, because there's just so many, I think of them as like doorways into comics. And it's great because there's so many avenues now that would lead you to comics compared to like most of the people my age. We have a similar story, like we read the same comics coming up because there weren't that many choices. Now if you're 20, like good luck finding somebody who's read the same comic as you. There's so many choices. So it's a really different world. And I think it's great, like as a fan of comics, I feel like it's the best it's ever been. It's getting all the other stuff in line, figuring out how to make it work for somebody that is making a life doing this. That's probably more challenging, navigating distribution, figuring out, even with Hulk Grand Design, like I have friends and they're like, how do I get this book? And it's like, I can't tell you that, it's almost like a secret treasure map to figure out how to actually buy a comic book. It's really difficult to navigate that maze. So, that part, not ideal, but in terms of like, if you can get through that maze, what you find is the greatest selection of comics, at least that I've ever been exposed to.
Yeah.
So that part's awesome. But, some of the other part, it's challenging. But I suppose in this day and age, all supply chains are challenging. So
yeah, but to see the thing about films advertise film, where to go see their film. Comics never advertise. Advertising Batman inside of a Batman comic doesn't help anybody find a Batman comic, right? And the companies, the big companies now, they basically Disney. Disney is spending no money on advertising for people to go, hey, by the way, if you like Avengers, there's some Avengers comics over at Amazon or wherever. They just don't advertise. And
I don't have any solutions on how to sell more comics, but I do wonder, like we blame these companies, and I was critical of the comic book publishing industry, but I wonder if there's a bigger thing here. Like if you read statistics on like adult American readers, like we just don't read.
No.
So if you're Disney or you're whoever, and it's like I can advertise the video game, I can advertise the movie, I can advertise the book, you're just not getting return on your dollars on that book. And it's not Disney's fault that we don't read.
And Disney's all about the dollar, because they used to do Disney Adventures, which I heard, and I did some work for them. I heard that they were selling 1 million copies.
Whenever we've been going through Wizard, like one of our early fun Wizard hunts was watching Bone develop. And one of the great, I think one of the great building blocks in Bone's history is that it got into the Disney Adventure comics, and around 1 million is what I was hearing too. And those used to be sold at checkout counters at the grocery store and stuff. So there have been these pieces of comics that have sold really well when nothing else was selling like those books. But I don't know.
But it wasn't enough. That was my second point. That's why they canceled it. It's so like you're making all that money, just not enough money. It's just it's like they have such a limit at which they will go. We will not. We're making piles, not enough piles. Netflix has their thing. It's like, oh, hey, this is a hit for 3 weeks. We wanted it to be a hit for 10 weeks.
Right.
Not coming back next season kind of a thing,
Hey, I have some questions from the room, and thanks everybody for joining us live. Jim, everybody's getting a little itchy. They want to talk about grand design, but we're not there yet. But there's really one. There's a couple of really great things in here. One of our day ones, Eternity Forever. What a great name. Says so, Jim. Going back to your origin, one of your first comics was a Hulk. Since you said it was Buscema and Wolverine, that must mean grand design is a full circle for you.
It really is. The first comic that I bought that really kind of got me into, whenever I was 10, go out and buy my first comic. It was a Marvel Comics Presents that had a Jeff Purvis gray Hulk in it. And I bought it because I liked the Hulk, and he was gray. And I was like, what is going on? I've got to know more. I didn't realize that wasn't like just a Hulk comic, but it had a gray Hulk story in it. And it was by a Hulk artist that I've come to love over the years, Jeff Purvis. So yeah, like, one of the first comics, maybe the first comic did feature a Hulk story. It was a couple issues after the John Buscema guest appearance of Hulk in that Wolverine Volume 1. I think that was like issue 7 or 8, and I come in at issue 10.
I think, right? Was it Mr. Fix-It?
Yes, Mr. Fix-It, yeah.
And I was in Al Williamson's studio when he was inking that stuff.
Wow. That blows my mind. My admiration for Al Williamson and his inks, because that was what I would see. Like I've gone back and seen all of his, well, not all of it, but I've seen, his work from when he's penciling and inking and back into EC in the 50s. But the inks that he did in the 80s at Marvel, I don't know if it gets better than that. We had John Romita Jr. on, and I was asking him, like, pick who the best inker is. In my mind, it's Al Williamson or Klaus Janson, probably like for Marvel inkers, at least, say in John Romita Jr.'s, day. So yeah, I can't believe that you spent time with Al Williamson. That's incredible to me. He's a guy that's very high in my echelon of greats.
Oh yeah, I mean he's at the top. I was just thinking like, wow, I was there, and you were like a kid reading And so it's funny how there's these like connections like
Mhm.
that.
Another thing, we're going to jump around a little bit. Another one of our penciliers here, notorious JRD. Jim says, Jim, was there a book that you read when you were young that spoke to you completely as a future writer, where the art was essentially incidental? Great question, JRD.
You know what, man? That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really good question. It's very rare that I look at a comic and think, I love the writing and not the art. It's hard for me to think of an example. But I read Yummy Fur, Chester Brown's Yummy Fur, whenever I was about 15 or 16. I got hold of some of it. And I
Mhm.
got some of the autobiographical stuff that he would do. And it was like a character that was within a couple years of my age. It's like middle school adventures of his.
Mhm.
And I never read a comic book like that, where it was like you go from pretending to relate to the Hulk, to like now this is a story about like a ninth grader who's can't talk to the girl that he likes. He's too nervous and his bullies are picking on him and stuff. And it was like, man, this is like it was amazing to read. It felt like energy bursting through my veins reading this thing because it felt so real. And
Mhm.
I remember the art was just strange, to go from like Jim Lee to Chester Brown, which is more in line with, say, a newspaper strip style.
Mhm. Mhm.
If you had to contextualize it, especially then, I had nothing to really compare it to. But I recognized like the art was totally different than what I was used to and what I was trying to draw. But it was also perfect for the story, and
Yeah.
the story really spoke to me. And I was aware, like, if this was drawn by Jim Lee, it wouldn't be the same. Like, I don't want to see Yummy Fur drawn by Jim Lee. Like, stay on Wolverine. But
Mhm.
this guy, like, the art works here. And that was a big influence on me because, like, if you look at my stuff, like, I'll draw stories in different styles based on what I think fits the story. And it's because, like, I love this, like Chester Brown is really the guy to point to for me for that moment of like recognizing the art style, the story, these things are really important to the reading experience. So
Mhm.
that was probably one where, like, in terms of writing, that one I had never read anything like that before, and
Uh,
it's stuck with me.
there's another question from our new buddy Dom Gomez. What up, Dom? Dom says, Jim, any strategies for studying sequential storytelling?
Oh man,
There's some hard curveballs coming in here.
I don't have a strategy because, like, I have a bookshelf here that is nothing but like sequential storytelling studies. I have it's a square, it's like a 9 square bookshelf, and it's like I have one of the squares is just typography and lettering. So my strategy is obsessively do it for decades. I've been doing it for 35 years. I watch videos on film breakdowns. Um, Follow artists and see what they recommend. Like, I have a book on um on cinematography because whenever I was about 12 or 13 and reading interviews, I would see artists recommend cinematography as a thing to study for comics. I still have the book from then. Like, I bought this
Mhm.
book when I was 14 and really it was over my head. But over the years, you keep going back and revisiting it. There's a ton of videos now that break down storytelling from movies to picture books to comics and video games. I would study any discipline that qualifies as storytelling. I have a book on my nightstand right now that I've been reading, and it's ad copy writers from
Mhm.
advertising talking about the way their words fit with images. So, like, I studied graphic design in school, and I say that's the other art that is words and pictures together. So
Mhm.
that's pretty useful for comics. Um, the other piece is just make stuff. Like, I used
Yeah.
to say that half of what I learned about making comics, I learned with my first mini comic.
Mhm.
So, make it and participate too, because then you can apply some of the stuff that you're studying and see if you can make it work yourself. Um, yeah, it never really ends. Read all the time, like
Yeah, yeah,
never stop reading.
yeah.
Cool. Thanks,
Yeah,
Tom.
when you think about you go back 50, 60, 70, 80 years, those guys didn't have any books on how to make comics, right? Milton Caniff didn't have a book on how to make comics. Jack Kirby didn't have. I mean, Jack Kirby looked at Milton Caniff and Hal Foster and that first generation. So that first generation of guys influenced like basically all the Silver Age and the Silver Age. But you go all the way back, those guys just had, like I always say, it's like there's people that can tell you a story and make it, I went to McDonald's today, and they would make it entertaining. They just have that rhythm and the way of telling, and can make something interesting and funny. You can tell a funny joke. You can give a great joke to somebody who's not good at telling a joke and is clumsy and self-conscious, and they'll get the rhythm all wrong. And so I agree with you. I think you get that question very often from up and coming people. And it's just like, draw 50 pages. By the time you've drawn your 50th page, you'll have started to figure out something that's working for you and why it's working.
That's a huge part. Yeah. Devote a little bit of time each day to actually applying the storytelling that you're studying, and draw, an hour a day or something like that, because that you could study your whole life. And if you don't actually do it and try to do it, like, what's it for? Like, you really do need that experience of actually making the thing. So, and comedy is a good one to study. Like when you were saying that, Mike, one, it is great. Like, go watch comedians. If they're not on the ball, they fail, they fail in real time in front of you. So yeah, that's a really economic way of storytelling. And there's nothing extra. You're just standing there by yourself. So you're either able to tell the story or you're not. But there's lots of examples of that. Like I went through crime fiction, reading a bunch of noir at one point, and some of that stuff, like you'll see these guys that are just, their prose are the short sentences and short words. They waste no time, and it's kind of magic. It's almost like you can't believe people can tell these stories so in such a gripping fashion and in such a direct way. So being able to communicate like that is really storytelling. And I mean, you could learn it almost anywhere.
Jim, I was thinking about some of the early books on my shelf about trying to figure all this horse hockey out when I was younger. And, we're kind of dating back to the pre-internet, almost maybe bulletin board era, where you may have stumbled onto a little bit of information that might lead you to a book. Like I remember there was kind of like Lorene Haynes's guide to writing comic books. And then there was one to drawing comic books. I think that's what it was. I had the Tony Caputo, How to Self-Publish a Comic.
I might have that on my shelf.
Yeah, you know what I mean? There was only so many tomes at that time. Did you kind of get any headway into reading some of, I don't know, I remember at one point everybody talked about Robert McKee's story book. That was a giant thing. Had nothing to do with comics, but it's just about, storytelling, screenwriting, a lot of screenwriting books.
I've read several of those, including Robert McKee's story. I took a screenwriting class a couple years ago that was fantastic. We would talk about it on Cartoonist Kayfabe, had a really good experience with that. And it's, that's part of what I mean by like, there's no one secret, like study the craft, but also be applying it as much as you can. And it's ongoing, it really is. Like, that's another thing that's exciting with comics. I don't know that you would ever get to the point of like, I've mastered it. Now I'm bored. Like, good luck. You know what I mean? Like most people, you're not going to master color. You're not going to master lettering, design. There's so many skills that go into it. If you get bored in one area, or you're just tired of taking figure drawing classes, by the way, take figure drawing classes. You can pivot. You can find another element of comics or visual storytelling and kind of go crazy with it, because like, and now there's not even like learn to use the brush. It doesn't matter, draw with whatever. You could take pictures and make your comic with that. You can do mixed media. Like at this point, like there just aren't rules for it. So really almost any visual skill that you learn is going to be something you could put to use on a comic page or on your screen, in service of whatever stories you're trying to tell. One of the great courses was the like the famous artist course, whenever eBay popped up, I remember that was one of the first things I bought, when it was like suddenly you could just find everything and buy a copy. I bought like a photocopy set of that and put it in a binder and everything. And I read a really good thing. I'm a big Alex Toth fan. And I read this thing. I want to say the late Jesse Ham would write about Alex Toth. And I got his PDF after he passed. And he had this chapter on Alex Toth supposedly used the famous artist course, at least the first couple of installments, including, I think the third chapter is composition.
Yes.
And so
that's
Ham
fantastic.
lays out this example, like pulling Alex Toth examples from like, I think the course is from the late 40s. And his idea is that Toth changes in the early 50s. And it's when he sort of becomes Toth. You know, I think of Toth as like the master of composition. And so Ham identifies this is the moment whenever it happens. And he's showing examples of him like experimenting and trying to apply some of these ideas that are in that famous artist composition chapter. And you can see they're not successful at first. And he writes beautifully about how like most people learn by adding something. You know, it's like, okay, I'm good at perspective now. I've got to work on getting figures, you know, integrating with my backgrounds, you know, and you sort of add pieces along the way. And that's how people learn. It's normal. You know, most people learn that way. What he suggests is that the harder way to learn is when you identify something that you don't do right and you try to correct it, because you have to go backwards. You know, you sort of have to go from like Toth was a working professional at that point, but he identified that he wanted to improve this compositional thing and takes a step backwards, which is really humbling and hard to do. Most people psychologically just can't do that. But then he just goes, you know, like massive steps forward as he learns these lessons. I always say, like, you can't unlearn how to ride a bike. So you got to kind of be careful what you learn, because if you learn the wrong way, it can be painful to sort of like fix some of those errors. But yeah, so yeah, there have been little bits of stuff here and there. But as a kid, I don't know how I would have gotten a famous artist course. You know, like it may have existed somewhere.
I mean, it did, but I mean, because they were actually on the back of the comics. But actually, that's one of the things that I always give to my students. You can actually get that, I believe, online. The Cartoonist Local 839 in Los Angeles has a bunch of stuff like that. They have the Preston Blair book up there. And I do believe they have the first famous artist painting course. And that chapter on composition, no one has ever done it better.
It's amazing. And, you know, like as a Toth fan, like I've read his, you know, the John Hitchcock correspondence, that book that has all their like back and forth writing and stuff. I've read enough Toth that like once I was pointed to that composition chapter, it was like, oh yeah, this is even like Toth's voice. Like he didn't just learn composition from this or improve his compositions from this. He also like, it seemed like he wrote, you know, like whenever you'd see him critique a story or somebody's cartooning or one of his own stories, it sounded like the voice was even similar. So yeah, it kind of blew my mind, like seeing some connection there between those two.
Yeah, well, he like Kirby is an autodidact. Those guys taught themselves how to do it by, well, like you said, by actually studying, but doing it, because you have to put it into motion so that it then it becomes pieces that you can. It's like boxing. You could read all the books on boxing.
Yeah, right.
It's not the same as getting socked in the head. You know what I mean?
Thankfully not.
Jim, I had a question about kind of consuming knowledge, absorbing knowledge. Any cartoonist will readily admit that they're students, right? We're all students. We're always learning. We're talking about that right now. One of my favorite things in the past maybe 10, 11 years has been that Reading Nancy essay. Have you seen that or read that?
I read some of it in the, like, I have a Nancy collection that printed like a short version of that. And then they've expanded that into the book. And I haven't read the book. Yeah.
It's a little thick. Like I haven't gotten through that. Like I used to give the essay out to my students in writing for comics. But just to kind of cue everybody in, there's a study of how Bushmiller like boiled down the essence of a comic strip down to every line. And if you kind of omit things, you'll see that this still adds up. It's compositionally, storytelling wise, it all kind of the adding and subtracting of everything is part of the whole puzzle. So my question to you, Jim, this might be a little spicy. Do you feel like all of the knowledge that you do have now over the years of just absorbing all of this stuff has ever stumped your growth as a cartoonist? Are you as spontaneous as you used to be when it was just you in a spiral notebook? Or do you overthink things now?
That's a good question. You know, I don't think I overthink them. Okay. I work differently for each project. And like for this Hulk Grand Design, you know, it's the most recent thing I've done. I wrote like an outline because I knew there was a lot of information and I had a finite number of pages. I had 80 pages to like, you know, cover 500 issues of a comic book. So I laid that out as like my script that I sent to Marvel was essentially an outline where like each page had maybe one sentence describing what was going to go on that page. And then when I created the book, I did it as single pages. Like usually I do spreads. But for the Hulk, I did single pages, and it would be like when a new page came up, I would start with that sentence. I would pull out whatever issues were covered in that span. Sometimes it'd be 20 issues, sometimes it'd be one issue, but it gave me, it was kind of like I'd start with a blank page and just know like, this is what I need on there. And what I needed wasn't that much, it was something narrative that I was planning, like, this is what the page is built around. And then I would write and draw it simultaneously. So it was pretty spontaneous. And, it would take, I was doing like 2 pages a week of everything. Like once I started a page, I would go all the way to like lettered and colored. And that would take about 3 days, 2.5, 3 days. And so in that time, it'd be like, I'd write some and draw some, and then it'd be like time to go to bed, or, read those comics that I'm working on and then go to sleep. And I'm kind of working out in my head at night. And whatever ideas I came up with, I tried. And I tried to use as many ideas as I thought of, like both visually and storytelling. So, I would have kind of notes of like, how about if you scan a panel from an old comic and put that on a page? How can you do something with that? Or how could you do one color on a page or a panel? What effect would that, could I link that to in terms of the story element or a detail or a character or something? So, it was pretty spontaneous in that I'm just laying down track as I'm going. I had an idea of where I was headed, and I kind of had the map of how to get there, but all the details would just show up as that page would happen. And a lot of times in the past, like I do stories that way, where I'll do a story, and in the course of doing it, I'll have some other ideas, and those just roll into the next story. And a lot of times the next story then is some reaction against the previous story. And for the Hulk, it was like the pages were that way. If I did a big splash page, maybe the next page had 20 panels.
Right.
Because it was like, you just wanted to make these pages different and new and challenging and not repeat stuff. And so, that was part of the process. And I worked with every kind of tool too. Like there's ballpoint pen and pencil and ink washes and watercolor and colored pencils and markers, and, whatever I have went into that book. And so I'm not too precious in terms of that stuff, because, if it doesn't work, you tear it up and do a new page. Especially when you're doing one page like that at a time. It's not a big deal if I'd have to redo a page. And I'm trying to think, I don't know if I actually threw out any pages on my own. But there is that freedom, it's like, okay, if I did come up with something that I thought I would redo panels. Like once I finished the draft, I would go back and sort of like fix panels that I thought I can do this better, or I've got a better idea for it, and it'll make I think it'll make the page and the book better. I would redo stuff, but I'm fairly good at like the spontaneous, let it go. If you program time at the end to like revisit it with fresh eyes and keep a list. Like often I'll keep a list of things that'll be like, these are potential edits, or at least these are things that I want to revisit in 2 months whenever I finish this draft. Let's see how I feel about them then. And, I have found that to be valuable, to have that list as ongoing and apply it at the end. Don't like get hung up on one page of like, I got to redo this, this page doesn't work. I got to keep working on it, because that's the stuff that would trip me up. I even got to the point where like that would trip me up for drawing a page, where it'd be like, the pencils aren't right. Like I can't go to inks yet because panel 4 isn't right. And I realized like, well, the first 3, I know what panel 4 needs to look like. I just can't figure out how to draw a hand or, the expression or something. But panels 1 to 3 are ready to go. And like, we're in the afternoon now. Like I'm wasting time. And I would start to ink the panels that I'm sure of. And you're looking at the other piece and kind of thinking and formulating. So that helped me a lot in terms of being a little bit more, I don't want to say efficient, but not getting hung up. And I kind of feel the same way about drafts. Like it's a problem for me, like if I start to fixate on one page, like you can really damage yourself. You could maybe never finish the story if you can't overcome that. So I tend to think like, get to the end of the draft and then fix the stuff.
Right.
So you don't have artist block, then, is what you're saying.
I try not to. I mean, I have, we all have. So it's like, you just try to avoid it at all costs, it's, so it's, that's one of the things that I do that helps me avoid it, is like, there's always something that I could be doing if whatever I started doing isn't working that day, like go color a page. Or
we talked about that before. Some people really will get into these things where they're like battling blocks. I've never had an artist block. I've had drawn stuff that I don't like. You know what I mean? And like you just, okay, I don't like that. I don't like that. But going back to the beginning, when you're doing your own stories, you're your own editor. So it's hard to get out of your own head to look at. Do you remember when you had your first experience of like having someone outside edit your stuff as opposed to you editing your process?
I don't remember something distinct like that, but I do. I will say this: like, I've worked for DC and Dark Horse and Marvel and different editors and stuff. I am far harder on myself than any editor I've ever worked with. So, take that for what it's worth. And I mean, the editors bring value. They find mistakes and it's helpful. But just in terms of like, I don't know if it's expectations or if it's me seeing every mistake that I've made and being aware of them, or being more critical of myself as opposed to maybe the editor's like, well, we need to get this to the printer. So maybe you could have drawn that hand better, but unfortunately do it on the next, the next page, the next issue, whatever it is.
Right.
So the first thing that I remember really doing with an editor was Plain Jane's with Shelley Bond. And that book started late. That was a graphic novel for their young adult line. It was the last one that they added, but the first one they planned to release. And I was new. And the writer, Cecil Castellucci, that was her first comic. And so Shelley, our poor editor, I think was just like, can these two deliver something that's okay and on time? And we would communicate every week. And that was awesome, because like I was turning in thumbnails for like, the following week, like a week's worth of thumbnails. I was like doing finished art on the previous week's approved thumbnails. So it was really great. And she was like clockwork, where it was like, I don't know, every Wednesday or something, we would either have a phone call or just email, like, here are my new pages, here's the feedback. And it worked really great. And then, as I've done more work, it's just not the relationship I have with other editors. Sometimes it's almost like I turn in an issue and then, it's like, all right, great, here's the voucher or something.
Right.
It's very different. But Shelley was there as like, what I thought of as like, this is what you want in an editor. In my mind, I had this whole checklist because I didn't go to school for comics and I was self-publishing and stuff. I thought like at some point I want to do a Marvel DC book where I work with their editorial system and learn from that. And Shelley was the first person I got to do it with, and she was amazing, and kind of atypical. Like I haven't had that experience. I've had good experiences with editors, but nothing sort of that close. And I think it's because it was a big project, and she had no idea if she could count on me to deliver or not. So it was probably smart on her part of being so hands-on. But from my point of view, it was just like, this is great. I'm working with the top editor and I'm getting notes and, my pages are getting better. So I was pretty lucky, I think, to kind of be in that position, because I don't think that's how it always works. My impression is maybe we need more editors, because it seems like, wow, are they, like the amount of stuff that editors do, a lot of books that they keep track of. So I wouldn't want to hurt all those artists. That seems like that could be a nightmare.
I mean, I've had so many different. I've had the editor that's like a ghost, we can't even get vouchers from. I was fortunate enough a couple times to work with somebody like Archie Goodwin, people like that, or Mike Carlin was really good. The person who would look at what you sent in and make a comment back to you. That you would know, okay, they're actually looking at my pages, other than going, okay, send to this person, send
right
to that person. It's really hard to get a good editor, because the first skill you really need is you need to be a people person. You need to be good at working with people. And comics in general, it's kind of the business where people are good with people. Like everybody's a hermit, We're
very antisocial.
Yeah. And like we were talking in the beginning of the podcast, one of the big tricks on your brain is you spend 350 days right here, right this far, right? Your brain is occupied.
Yes.
Space and your interior space. And then you go to a convention and it's like, there's like people, and hey, and ho, and it's like such a complete bombshell to your brain. So you could have met somebody at the Pittsburgh Con in like 1990, and you would like, I don't remember. But yeah, it's also different now because that old school that I came up with, where they had the bullpen, and you still had the lineage of everybody who had been trained by Stan's generation or Roy Thomas's generation or Dick Giordano's generation, all their disciples are basically all gone.
Mm-hmm.
So you do have a younger person very often today who may not actually be familiar with the material that you did, and part of your job is to educate them about your process and about what you have done, because now we've flipped 3 generations easily since the late 90s.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I saw somebody something recently on social media, somebody had posted, and it was like the DC office, sheet, call sheet from sometime in the 90s. And I think no one was still there like in that editorial capacity. And it's not that long ago, it might've been 25 years ago, but to have like nobody still on that list, it does turn over. But I think that's true in traditional publishing too.
Mm-hmm.
I had done a book with Little Brown, and I think I went through 3 editors in about a year there. So,
Wow.
I think there is a lot of turnover just in general in publishing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's different. You hear about those old school editors, and a lot of them, Dick Giordano, like a great artist. And now he's in an editorial position, perfect for comics. And you don't see as much of that anymore. Like the artist that moves into the editorial position. And I think that makes a different kind of communication.
Jim
Mm-hmm.
Lee is like the guy, right? He's sort of the modern, because Jim could look at your drawing, and he's also on the editorial side.
Yeah.
And like DC had a lot of people like that, like Joe Orlando and Dick Giordano were up there at the same time.
I realized recently Cliff Chang was an editor for a while at DC, and like, I just think of him as this really great artist, but like, oh yeah, okay. Imagine if he was your editor and, was giving you feedback on your art, like that's a valuable thing. And it's not as common now, I don't think, that an editor has an art background.
Before we get out of here, because we just chewed up a lot of time, Jim, we have a little bit of time left. You're not leaving before we talk about Street Angel. You're not leaving before we talk about your podcast. But I want to get through some of these grand design questions because they're starting to add up. Our buddy D. Brad, what up, D. Brad? D. Brad says, Jim, did you have to pitch your Hulk idea, or did Marvel come to you based on your strength making classic style comics?
It's a good question, D. Brad. And I'll be honest, I don't totally remember the circumstances. Ed Piskor, my friend, we were doing Cartoonist Kayfabe, or maybe about to start it, whenever he did X-Men Grand Design. And that book went really well. And so then at that point, I think Marvel contacted a number of artists, and Ed might have given them a list or recommended some or something. And they reached out about like, hey, do you want to do a pitch for a Grand Design? And I did, and it was the Hulk. But I did do a pitch for that. But I think Marvel may have asked me for the pitch, if I can remember, sort of, what feels like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was both. I did put together a pitch, and I should dig out that pitch. I'd be curious to take a look at it now, because it's been probably 4 years or something. They did not greenlight it right away.
Right.
They Ed finished the X-Men Grand Design, which was 3 books, or 6 comics and 3 books, and then Tom Scioli did Fantastic Four Grand Design. And it was probably near the end of Fantastic Four Grand Design that Marvel got in touch with me that, the Hulk was going to go. So, yeah, it's been a while since I put together that pitch, but I remember some details were very different than what I ended up doing.
Also, D. Brad says, I saw a page from Grand Design and I thought it looked like Toth style.
That is, see, I would be reading D. Brad's questions too, because of these kind of comments. You're buttering me up when you say stuff like that. I love it.
We got to put you over, Jim. You know how it works. Cool. Thanks, D. Brad. Also, our buddy Eternity Forever also asks, did you work on Grand Design and anything indie at the same time? If so, how did you do that?
A tiny bit. I did a Kickstarter a year and a half ago now that was Octobriana 1976, the world's first blacklight comic. And what had happened is I started working on Hulk Grand Design, but the contracts weren't done. And Marvel was like, whoa, like, hold on, we've got to finalize contracts. Don't do this yet. So I went from that to like Octobriana, and then the pandemic happened. So there was some overlap there between Hulk and starting and stopping Hulk and doing Octobriana in 1976, which I published with Ad House Books, but I did a crowdfunder with it. So not totally self-published, but about as indie as you can get.
Yeah, I was funny with that because I found a copy of that October Rama, the actual original comic, like in a used bookstore downtown in Philly, and it was like, what is this weird, like sort of like Russian Barbarella kind of? It was very odd. Like some of the parts were were kind of cool, and then some parts would look like he didn't look like he even drew all of it or something. It was very strange.
It's one of my favorite stories, because like the story is this guy smuggled this out that it was an underground Russian comic that was against the Soviet Union, but was being done by Russians. And there was a whole backstory of like how they would make these and, what the character was about. It was appropriating Western superheroes to oppose, the USSR. And it all turned out to be that was all made up. But it did generate, like that's in the book, as if the book is nonfiction. And then you realize years later, it was revealed that wasn't true. It was, I hate to say hoax, but the guy fabricated the book and even the art was stolen from a couple of Czech artists. So yeah, the book is not at all what it purports to be, but it's kind of a fascinating piece of comics history. It's part of what hooked me into like, this is the character to play with.
So did you find the book yourself and then get like, well, what is this thing? And then start
that's exactly it. I love weird comics, and it was in one of those. It was in like the Leather Nun book. I want to say Paul Gravett, but I'm not positive that's who did it. But he had done a compilation of like the weirdest comics, like 50 of the weirdest comics, and that's I think where I found it. It was listed. It was like you'd get one page of art and then like a summary of what it was, and it was the weirdest thing. And then that character would pop up. Like Brian Talbot used the character. I think he was the first guy to really use the character in Adventures of Luther Arkwright, because it was like a public domain character the way it was published. And then other cartoonists started using it, and it's like combine that with the backstory, and it's like, what a great character.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know. I probably have it somewhere back there over on the bookshelf, and I just found this weird thing. It's like one of the best things is to go into old bookstores. Sometimes you find something really weird like that.
Yes. Yeah, that's an odd one, but one of my favorites. It's odd but good.
So Jim, talk about Street Angel real quick before we talk about anything else, because I was introduced to your work through Street Angel, and I just thought it was like super fresh. And even I don't forget how long ago. When did you start Street Angel?
I think 2003 was the first published something.
It's what I loved about it, and I'm giving you your flowers, is I love that it was masterfully done, and even though you kind of gave it a loose kinetic energy, you knew exactly what you were doing. You know what I mean? And I could read that through your artwork. It wasn't like you were figuring it out so much on the page, but it's almost like you're controlling how you were making this look, if that makes sense.
That sounds nice. Again, like knowing what I know about it, I can tell you I was not in control. Whatever worked in that book was probably a lot more luck than it was, something I knew how to do. But I had done, I was doing mini comics at that point for a couple of years. And I hooked up with this guy at work, Brian Maruka, who we've been writing together now for 20 years. He was a tech writer. I was a designer in an engineering company. So like, we were just like goofing off in email, and I kind of knew how he wrote. And I was like, read my mini comic or read my script. And then pretty soon we were just sending emails back and forth. And Street Angel comes out of like a time where I was so burnt out from regular comics, and I wanted to make something opposite. Like I would go to the new comic book day and it'd be like, man, I just don't want to read, part 4 of this 6-part Punisher story, or I think the bad girl stuff was still going on at the time. And I would look at new comics and just be like, I don't want any of this. I want something else. And so Street Angel became the opposite, you know, like where, you know, being rich and being able to kick everybody's ass is the power fantasy. Like we were going to make a character that nobody fantasized about being, you know, switching places with Jesse Sanchez. And so like the whole book sort of evolved that way. Instead of being a 6-part series, it was going to be like every issue was self-contained, tried to make them fun, you know, just all these things that I wasn't seeing in like the main. Yes, fun was a good one. And we used to get that, you know, like so many people would come up and that's what they would say is it's fun. Yeah. So it was an unlikely hero and a little bit of a different storytelling model than was popular at the time. And did 5 issues with Slave Labor Graphics, SLG, who published Evan Dorkin and Johnny Homicidal Maniac. That was my first published book. That's what led to the Plain Janes. And I did 5 issues. And at that point, the cushion, the lead time I had, I used up. And so they did a collection of it and I went on to other things. And then about 10 years later, Ad House Books, who I did a lot of publishing with, put a collection out because it had been out of print for, you know, 8.5 years. So we put a collection together and I was like, I still like this character. Like maybe I want to do some new Street Angel, and pitched it to Image Comics and then did like another volume in color. And, you know, 10 years, hopefully a better cartoonist, quite a few hundred pages later. And so, yeah, you know, she's a homeless ninja on a skateboard is kind of my quick pitch of her. And whatever you see in comics, especially superhero comics, it's fair game. So evil scientists, demon monsters, ninja gangs, you know, whatever it is, like you might see it in a Street Angel comic. And, yeah, it's just it's a comic that I enjoy making. I often think I know people who do like nonfiction comics that are just heavy, and I think like, man, I would not want to research, you know, Bosnian War or something like that for 24 hours a day, because the stuff does get in your head. You dream about it, and that was part of what drew me to doing more Street Angel was like, you know, this is a cartoon. Like this is what's more fun than sitting down at the drawing table and having her fighting ninjas and skateboarding around rooftops and stuff. And it became just like, hopefully the fun that I want to get in the comic, I was getting making the comic. So, you know, hopefully that comes through.
Have you, go ahead, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I felt like your love of like 70s cinema and Frank Miller's Daredevil, which you must have loved as a kid.
Yes,
right?
I did. I traded a bunch of Rob Liefeld New Mutants for a run of Frank Miller's Daredevil when I was young enough that, man, did I get lucky with that trade.
And fun is something I guess we don't talk a lot about on the podcast, but I think it's something that can get lost in the mix. It's one of the things I think first things that can get kind of lost in the mix. That I sort of always felt like when I read a Jack Kirby comic, he was always having fun. I never feel like I read a Jack Kirby comic where he was like, this is just fuck this, you know, and you just like put a cigar on it or something. I feel now sometimes, especially in the 90s, there was a lot of ponderousness about comics, which relates to also the feeling that some professionals would have towards other professionals because there was a competition. And I sort of feel like the old guys had fun and they didn't take it as serious. And then in the 90s, it was like people started making enough money off of one comic to buy a house, right? And that changed people's attitudes about the profession, because everybody starts out wanting to do it because it's fun. But then when you were in it, sort of became a different beast at times. And so when I would see something like Street Angel, I would go, this guy is having fun. And I know myself when I was working in comics in the 90s, I was often not having fun. I was trying to be, in my mind, what a professional was, which was actually the previous generation of what a professional was, right? And sometimes it was not necessarily fun. There was all these other things attached to it. So when I saw Street Angel, it really stood out to me. One, because I felt like you could see what you loved, and I could see that you loved doing it. And I didn't feel that there were 1,000 strings attached to it.
It's 100% accurate. And I think about that whenever I get into situations where it isn't fun, because like I don't make a lot of money off of comics. You know what I mean? And I always think like it makes you happy or it makes you money. And I try to make sure the comics stay in that category. You know, like there are easier ways to make money. So like if you're doing comics but you're miserable, they're just easier ways to make money. I love making comics, but I'm also not, I don't do a lot of work for hire. Like most of the comics that I make, it's almost like the other jobs, whether it's freelancing or whatever, that allows me to make whatever comics I want, and then I sell them. Octobriana, that Kickstarter is a really good example. Like I was done with that comic before I went to the Kickstarter and published it, so like I had made the comic I wanted to make. And then it was like, all right, now how do I sell it? Which is a different thing, but it wasn't like, okay, I have to sell this, or I'm making this and I'm trying to get somebody to say yes to it. It was more like, there's nothing I want to draw more than this right now. And now I've drawn it. And now, okay, how do I connect that to an audience that hopefully will have a similar reaction? But Mike, you mentioned those Kirby comics. That early days of Street Angel is probably when I really got the most into Kirby. At that point I had access, I was doing comic book shows. So I had access where like I could go buy these comics, first issue specials like Dingbats of Danger Streets. I just loved Commandy. Right. All these comics were so good, and they're exactly what you said. Like they are fun. Like it would be exciting for me whenever I would get a couple of new Kirby's at a convention and go home and get to read those. And I'm sure that energy was sort of like influencing what I was doing, where it's like, yeah, like make a banger of a comic, like one, just worry about issue 2, and then just worry about issue 3, as opposed to I'm building a universe or I'm making the graphic novels or whatever. It was just like, try to make the best comic book, like one issue at a time, because I know people like I had friends my age, and it'd be like their first project was a 200-page graphic novel. And my brain doesn't work that way. I would think you're foolish. Like nobody could do that. And they did it. They could do it. Some people, like everybody's brain works differently. But for me, it was like a comic book was a unit I could sort of like wrap my head around, take me maybe 3 months or so to do an issue, but that wasn't insurmountable, like 200 pages, that'd be like 2 years or something, like who knows where I'd be by then.
My first comic will be Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Not mine. Like I knew my limitations, but the comic book was a good amount for me, like I could really kind of like plan that, and you can make progress a couple of weeks in and you might be halfway through it, and that felt good. It felt like, yeah, I can reach the end of this. So I don't know, it fit me pretty well, and I'm sure it's different for everybody, but it allowed me to sort of like, you could see the progress, and that was a positive thing, where it was like, all right, I've got some ideas now for, let's do another issue of Street Angel, that kind of thing.
So what was the impetus for it? I mean, did you decide you wanted to, like, why make it a girl, or just to go against,
going against everything, like
these,
comics were really a boys club then, and I was kind of tired of that. Like I would go to some of these conventions, and like an SPX or a MoCA, you would go there and it'd be like, it's half men and half women here. Why isn't every show this way? That was kind of the early days of that. I mean, like now I think it's much better, but the comic book shop at the time, and they were great shops and stuff that I would go to, but it was still like, this is boys club, like all that new comics rack, that's all like 14-year-old male fantasy.
Just a sausage factory.
Yeah. And they didn't speak to me anymore. Like at that point I had a day job. I was probably married at that point, like I was this adult, and it was like, these just don't offer me what I want. So, I mean, almost all of Street Angel came out of that. It started out really mad, like it was kind of me as a young man, angry that comics weren't what I wanted them to be. And after, I don't know, a week or so of that, it sort of stepped down a little bit, where it was like, I don't want to feel this way, speaking to like what you're channeling when you're drawing the thing. And I realized like, I can't channel rage for like creating a whole book. Right. And it changed, it became much more of like, what do I like about comics? What do I love about comics? As opposed to like, what do I hate? And I mean, the two sort of aren't that dissimilar, but it really was like, you know, I'm going to have a girl for my protagonist, because that's not what I was seeing from, you know, the Marvels and DCs. And if there was, you know, if it was a female lead, it would be like Witchblade or something, you know, just not the same thing as a young Peter Parker Spider-Man. So that was most of the creative decisions were based on that. It was like, what's on the new comic rack? Go the other direction.
Okay. Jim, how you feeling? We're going to start rapid. So you feeling good? You feeling punchy?
I'm going to make it through.
All right, we're good. It's a marathon.
Well, how much time did it take you with your, like you say, I have this idea, and then like you start, it's like I'm going to make a salad, and you start, I'm going to put some of this in, I'm going to put some, no, I'm going to take this out, I'm going to put this. Did you have, I mean, it seems like, Dave Stevens supposedly said you just put in everything you want to draw and you take everything out you don't want to draw.
That's good advice.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I did not have Dave Stevens' confidence or his drawing ability. So Brian and I would write really tight scripts. Like, man, we would fight about it. Like every script we would end up with, there were times when it was like, all right, this is it. We're no longer partners. How do we like separate? You know, we're done. Because we would fight over this stuff. But, you know, we were just trying to make these stories the best they could be. The way we would usually work is we would write them as like a short story, because Brian's background wasn't in comics and I was just obsessed with comics, and I wanted to do the comic part. Like, I wanted to take the story that we like and then I will adapt that into the comics. Because I mean, that's another thing that I think we miss a lot in the assembly line comics of today. Like, I think the scripts, you know, tight scripts, it used to be the artists that were the storytellers, you know, and they were able to sort of innovate visually on the page as they were like telling this stuff, like, oh, we'll have them crash through the window, you know, and that'll make sense as a page turn or whatever. You know, there were all these like visual elements that were up to the artist, and that's mostly been relegated to the writer. And, you know, that has some advantages, but it has some disadvantages if what you like are kind of like the visual acrobatics of a Jack Kirby or John Romita Jr. You know, a lot of that stuff I think is harder to find now if you're working from a really tight script. So that's one thing that Brian and I would do, is like, we would have it like a short story, just prose. And once we were happy with that, I would take it and then I would turn that into a comic and break it into a script and pass the script back to him. But it was me figuring out like, okay, this is a 3-panel sequence, or I'm going to do this cool like page turn, or, you know, whatever the case may be. But it relied on like kind of the visual, the storytelling part, which I think that's what I'm best at, is the storytelling part. And it's a bummer, because I think that's the toughest part to sell or to explain or to see at like a glance. You know, like that works when you read it. But if you're just like walking through the show, or you see an image on Instagram, it doesn't necessarily tell you too much about kind of the storytelling mechanics, unfortunately.
I always say it's like, when I teach my storyboarding class, I say it's like, what you're doing is you're creating a magic spell, and you have to have all these things, and all these things work. You are not aware of the fact that you're reading a drawing and you're looking at things, just like when you're watching a film or you're watching a cartoon. And if some element doesn't jive correctly, so it's disharmony, the reader falls out of it, and they usually never fall back into it, because then the spell is broken. And so the layout, the storytelling, is the most creative part, even though drawing is creative, but the formal quality of how you construct a story in comics or film is the most brain part. The other part is practice. You know how to draw a hand if you study how to draw a hand. But you have a lot of people that can draw great hands, but they're not good at telling a story. Their storytelling doesn't flow. It's image, 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 instead of flow. Right? And flow is more, in comics, flow is more important. And the image sort of,
you know, it is. I think it is for some readers. It is for me. You know, and it probably sounds like it is for you, and it probably is if you make comics. But I don't know if it's as important as I like to think it is. Like, that's my interest in comics. I saw somebody posted a question: what do I look for in an idea that motivates me to run with it? The ideas are almost the least of it. You know, like when people pitch when you hear a pitch, when it's like, oh, it's Jaws meets Close Encounters, I don't know, whatever. It's a terrible mashup. But it's, you know, when you hear the pitch, it tells me nothing about the part of the story that I enjoy, because I enjoy the storytelling. And you just don't get that in a description or in the plot. You know, so it's kind of a funny business in that way. Like the stuff that I respond to the most, you couldn't sell to a bunch of executives in the room.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the thing that will make everybody go back to the movie.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true or not.
Really?
That's the thing that would make me go back to the movie. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff I love that didn't do well at the box office, or didn't sell a lot of comics, didn't get a second printing, or a long run. You know, so it might make me go back and reread this book, but it doesn't mean that everybody, you know, like that's not indicative of how that book's going to actually do, at least in my experience.
Yeah. And there could be a lot of things that affect, like Westerns are popular, but then Westerns are not popular, or, you know, it's too many rom-coms this year, or I mean, there's all that. But I'm just talking about the reason why you love Frank Miller's Daredevil was that.
Yes, totally, 100% agree.
Right, and that was one of the first comics I felt when I was reading that, where I really felt that whole thing, right? That flow. I mean, you felt it with Gil Kane and you felt it with John Buscema, but I felt they were speaking more comics, and he was trying to bring film, sort of that feeling of film, and lots of long horizontal panels. Not that other people hadn't done.
The storytelling is definitely different, because if you go back and you read other comics from that time period, like if you read, I'm trying to think if like Claremont and Byrne X-Men is that time period. To me, they just don't hold up the same. Like I can reread those Frank Miller Daredevils. It's a different storytelling. Comics Journal reviewed one of like early in Street Angel, Comics Journal did a review of it, and they cited a bunch of manga as an influence. And I had not read much manga at that point. My manga influence was being filtered from Frank Miller, because, you know, Miller's influenced by that. And I think you see that in some of those long panels, and, you know, they're not bogged down by captions the way most of those comics were, or by word count. I guess it's not all captions, you know, but in Miller's case, like it was very sparse. If he was telling some action sequence, there might not be any words, you know, like the art was really like, hey, this is a quick sequence. I'm not going to slow you down by putting a bunch of words on the page. That was different, you know, and you go back and look at those comics, like his contemporaries, it's hard to find comic storytelling like the storytelling that's in those Daredevils. And I think it makes them rereadable, while a lot of that other stuff, it's tough. It's tough to read, you know, like it moves at a glacier pace, and like we've only gotten faster, you know, like now it's 40 years or more. You know, we're moving so much faster that like you go read a Chris Claremont X-Men from 1981, that's 25 minutes of your life right there.
Or like I was looking at a beautiful Gene Colan, Tom Palmer,
such a good team,
Dracula page. There was so much writing on this page.
Yes.
Or an old Marvel 2-in-1. You go by any old Marvel 2-in-1 from like 1978. There's like 5 comics worth of storytelling in one old 2-in-1 compared to a comic today.
Yeah.
You know.
There was a question, Jim, and it's not spicy, but I think it's a really it's not spicy, but it's a really interesting take on kind of grand design, and I'd love to hear your answer to this. Eternitine asks, what do you think projects like grand design accomplish within the comics community? What do you feel like grand design is? I don't know. What is it saying to?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good satisfying answer for that. I've been asked about how, you know, is it good for longtime Hulk fans? And my answer is, I hope so, you know, because it's recounting these great moments, you know, and that could be an artist, that could be a historical element. Like I have the Rolling Stone cover from 1972 reproduced in there, which is outside of continuity, but is like part of Hulk's history. But if you have favorite artists, favorite storylines, it'd be great for a longtime Hulk fan for that reason. But it's also the perfect book to put in somebody's hands that's never read a comic. Like I pride myself in my comics being readable, like my mother could read them. And you hear people talk about how confusing comics can be to read to somebody that's not familiar with that format. So I believe the comic is something you could put in the hands of somebody who's like, I love the Hulk, but I've never read a Hulk comic. So good for longtime fans, good for first time fans. What does it accomplish for a comics readers community? I don't know how to answer that. I don't even know what a comics readers community is exactly, because like I often say, even in the comic book store, you'll have somebody who has every Spider-Man comic. That's what they buy, Spider-Man comics. You'll have somebody who slabs key back issues. You'll have somebody else who's reading the manga. And it's like, there might be half a dozen groups that come through a comic book store on New Comic Book Day that almost don't overlap with each other. So it's hard for me to say like how it fits overall. My goal is to create a book that anybody could have, like you could leave it as a coffee table book. So hopefully that's something of an answer, but ultimately, I don't know. I don't know that it's going to change the face of comics. There aren't too many books that have done that over the years, I don't think. But I do think it's a book that you could hand to somebody who maybe likes the Marvel movies, but hasn't read a comic, doesn't know where to start. So maybe a gateway to some potential new readers. And it's also something that it was hard to read 500 issues of the Hulk. It was hard to get access to 500 issues of the Hulk, just physically being able to get to that material. So it's also a way to like, here's the Hulk history, in a pretty easy catch up. And if there's something that speaks to you, there are notes in the back, like you could go and kind of read the expanded, the unabridged version. If you're like, wow, I really like Joe Fixit, let's go track down that collection. So, it may be a guide for people too, who aren't as familiar with all of this history, but they're interested, like this would be a way to like, well, check it out and see which parts speak to you, and then look in the back and you can go find more of that. So
Jim, I have we're gonna punch your ticket here soon, but I wanted to get in a couple more and do a plug for the podcast. Our good buddy Jim Lujan, what up, Jim Lujan? Salute to the general. Jim says, "What's your perspective on Easter eggs in comics and stories? Do you put things in the background of your books still, or did you ever?"
Yeah, I definitely do. And the Hulk is full of them. So. And a lot of them made it past editors. So they will be something that readers will get to look at and hopefully recognize some different stuff. I mean, why not? Like, isn't that fun? Isn't that part of the fun of reading this stuff or rereading it? So I am pro, Easter eggs. I enjoy when we look at old McFarlane books, looking for Felix the cat, knowing that that's in most of his comics. That's kind of a fun little thing if you've been through them already, but you're going through them again. So yeah, I like that. I'm pro all of that. I want to be as entertaining as I can. I want to reward multiple readings. And I think Easter eggs are one way to sort of like reward that person who's going through the book a second or a third time.
Okay. And I think we have time for one more thing. Let's get it in for Cartoonist Kayfabe. So D-Brad asks the $100 question. How did you guys get that title? I know the answer because I'm a wrestling mark, but if you want to kind of talk about it real quick.
Yeah, well, we're both wrestling fans, and kayfabe is a pro wrestling term. That's part of it. Kayfabe is the idea of keeping the secrets of wrestling. We're kind of sharing the secrets of comics, so maybe we're doing a little bit the opposite. But it's alliterative. So when we were trying to figure out a good title, at some point we came up with Cartoonist Kayfabe, and we liked how it sounded. And so it's that's really, I think, how it stuck. But I am a pro wrestling fan, and it is because of storytelling. I had fallen out of it. And when everybody started podcasting, I just loved hearing the old wrestlers telling stories, and they talk about storytelling. Like any wrestler that has any history, like as a career, they talk about storytelling, and some of it's in promos and some of it is what the booker is writing, with angles, but they also talk about it within matches. And so I was looking at it as, if I can understand how you tell a story between the bells, just like a fight, I can use that in a superhero comic. And so that's kind of how I got into pro wrestling, was just like, let's get into the mechanics of how you guys tell a story. And one of the great ones is Steve Austin did a story where somebody asked him about like the biggest pop that he had ever received. And it was during another match that he did a run in. he went through the match. He watched the match and he did commentary on the match, maybe 15 minutes or so. But it was totally from his point of view. So he's talking about the stairs as a prop. He's talking about like different cues that people are responding to, what the fans are doing. And somebody synced it up with the video of the match. So you could kind of see him almost doing like a director commentary, or, you know, he didn't direct the match, but that kind of insight.
Right.
And it was just amazing to see it and to kind of like see what are the storytelling bits. You know, it's whenever the guy who can't be beat throws a punch and ends up missing and hitting a chair and breaking his hand. And now suddenly, all right, the rest of the match, now he can't use his right hand. Right. You know, it's these kinds of little pieces. And so that really spoke to me. And, you know, like, I mean, it's most of the podcasts I listen to at this point are old wrestlers or retired wrestlers talking about their craft. And it's kind of come to be pretty fun, you know, over the years. we use a little bit of wrestling slang now and then whenever we're talking about storytelling or talking about making comics. So it's mostly good fun.
Yeah, that I think that's funny because Jamar, you, my buddy Scott, a lot of the guys, you're all right around the same age. And wrestling is like a big thing for you guys.
Love it, bro.
Like, I watched wrestling when I was a kid, and I actually wrestled in high school, but the wrestling was never, I think maybe because I wrestled, and I was like the old like Dick the Bruiser and Haystacks Calhoun and all that kind of stuff. It was not all, it was like cheap. It was not theatrical, and it wasn't, you know, all pumped up like, you know, the stuff. But it's funny because that is like a generational thing with cartoonists of a certain age. And I think it also it reflects in what you guys like also about the comics medium, because there was really sort of an overlap, I think, in the way, because you had the heroes. You know who was telling me about that was Archie Goodwin.
Yeah. Yeah, it's foundational, you know, and wrestling goes back over 100 years, what we think of as professional wrestling. And it's founded on that stuff with the hero, with the good guys and the bad guys being very clearly defined, you know, and playing with the psychology of the crowds, whether it's like popular trends of the day. There's a lot there, I think, that you can pull out. And I was just talking to a guy who, he's sort of an investigative journalist, and he's working on a wrestling book. And I read a lot of wrestling books. And one of them that I read was a biography of Mildred Burke, one of the first women's champions. And the guy that wrote it is an investigative journalist as opposed to like a pro wrestling fan. And he would cite his sources, but he would also sort of like explain, when this event happened, we have the promoter's information on it. We have a local newspaper account of it. We have Mildred Burke's account of it, and they're all completely different. And so here he is 60 years later trying to figure out what really happened that night. And how do you know at that point? You know, there's no witness that you can talk to. You just have these totally different accounts, even like things that you would think were factual, like how many people were at the building, stuff like that, completely different, even though it's the same event. And I was talking to this guy about it, and he said, he had done some comics journalism as well. He said comics are the same way. You know, Stan Lee has this version of like the Marvel creation of the Marvel Universe. Jack Kirby has his version of the creation of the Marvel Universe. Almost certainly neither of those versions is accurate, but they're kayfabe. You know, they're great storytellers that are telling their version of the truth or their version of the story that they want out there. And they're writing their own histories, and it's almost impossible to actually get to the truth of it now.
Yes, I think Stan is talking. I read a thing of Romita like riding in a car or something with him. And I think Stan is doing this, and Jack is doing this, and Marvel is somewhere in between.
The comics is full of this. We've been reading these depositions, and you realize like all of this stuff, Todd McFarlane and Neil Gaiman, like their versions of like their dispute. If you heard one side of it, you'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I get it. Except they're totally different versions. When you hear them both, then you're going, oh geez, what actually happened? And it's the same way wrestling storytelling is. And according to this journalist friend of mine, it's like those are the two fields where it is just all kayfabe. Like good luck separating fact from fiction, especially once you go back a couple of decades. like
Oh,
because everybody's just telling their own version of the story.
You can't remember what you did in 2000, and you haven't had a closed head injury.
Exactly.
And that's all part of keeping the business protected. Nobody really knows the story.
Well, my entire history of comics, working in comics, has been a handshake deal. Someone calls you on the phone. Do you want to do that? You saw somebody at a show. Hey, you want to draw? You talk, get the script. I mean, I had a couple disputes at Marvel where it was a handshake deal. I was supposed to do something, and then all of a sudden it changes offices with the editor, and that new editor goes like, I don't know you from, and they gave it to somebody else. Then you got to go to, Tom DeFalco and go, hey, what the hell's going over here? I was supposed to do this. Because it was all handshake. It was all somebody called somebody on the phone and said, you want to draw? I had a whole Wolverine series canceled, picked up and canceled with that kind of thing, because one person says you want to do it, you're going to do it, and then two editors start fighting with each other about some other thing, and it's like, well, fuck you, then I'm not going to approve your thing, right? It's not like Hollywood where you have a contract, and before you go forward, everybody's signing, you're giving away your left testicle, all that stuff. Comics, for most of its existence, even till today, is somebody calls you on the phone. Marvel calls you on the phone and goes, hey, do you want to do this Hulk thing? Right? It's not like you're getting things like in a normal business. Comics, like you said, is not a normal.
Yeah. I think all the time, like, I can't believe that people put in a full career this way. And I've had a good experience with Hulk and with my editors. Like it's gone very smoothly. I've been saying, if you like Hulk Grand Design or you don't like Hulk Grand Design, like the buck stops with me. They let me make the book I wanted to make.
Right.
But it's still like, I'm ready to go back to I'm just going to make my own comics for a while now. And that was not an assembly line process. They gave me a lot of freedom, but it's still that idea of like, going through editors, having bosses that you're not even talking to that need to approve this stuff. It surprises me that so many people can work in that system for years of their life. Like in my mind, and maybe it's because I come from doing my own thing, but wow, the freedom that you can have, it's hard to like not have that.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap it. I think the last word should go to Eternity Forever, who says, superheroes, comics, and wrestling, both are tales of men in underpants hitting each other.
That's right.
Chef's kiss on that. I love it. Jim, you've been a fantastic guest. Please tell us where we can follow you on the internets.
Well, you can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/Jim Rugg. I post a lot of original art, lots of process. Really, it's how I make the comics I make, along with probably about a dozen of my mini comics and out-of-print zines and things, smaller print run things that are just long gone. You can download when you join my Patreon. You can, of course, check us out on YouTube at Cartoonist Kayfabe. We are a daily, all things comics YouTube channel. Please subscribe there. And we do everything. We interview other cartoonists. We read depositions about comics history. We look at Wizard Magazine to figure out how it all went wrong in the 90s. But we look at comics. We look at history. We've done some Golden Age and Comics Code stuff recently that got me really excited about some older comics. But that is Cartoonist Kayfabe. That's a great place to follow me. I'm on Instagram at Jim Rugg Art, all one word. And I just post art and occasionally a cat picture, but I'm kind of behind on the cat pictures. So if you like my comics or if you like following cartoonists, you can follow me there. And Hulk Grand Design will be in your local comic shop in March and in April. So pick that up when it comes out.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. We're going to get out of here. I don't know if you see our sign off. I think you'll enjoy this.
I know it. Yeah.
You guys, thank you so much. Hopefully we'll be back here next Wednesday at 8 p.m. same time with more dope content to our great guest, Jim Rugg, to my best bud, Mike Manley. I'm Jamar Nicholas. Let's get out of here. You know what to do next, guys. Wash those Kirby hands.
Oh, here's some Kirby hands right here.
Yo, I love it. Those are fantastic, Jim. You're Avenger now, kid. Thanks, you guys. See you next week.
Thanks, guys.